Hello, welcome to Forbidden Talk, where we discuss controversial social issues in the Middle East. Today's topic is human trafficking, with a particular focus on Iraq and Syria. The Islamic militant group known as ISIS has established a large presence in the Syrian civil war and in June 2014 launched a major offensive in northern Iraq. The extremist group has been condemned internationally for its brutal tactics. However, Arab and Muslim governments have been virtually silent on ISIS's systematic abuse and humiliation of women and children. Their violent tactics have also included sex trafficking and slavery. Whilst the precise number of people being held is unknown, in August alone, ISIS is estimated to have kidnapped 2,500 Yazidi women. Since then, Kurdish authorities have rescued just 100 of these women, all of whom had been raped. In October, United Nations researchers confirmed that 5,000 to 7,000 women were being held by ISIS. We shall be going into these awful atrocities in more detail, as well as the wider issue of human and sex trafficking in the Middle East. But first, I'd like to welcome my studio guest, Dr. Rebwa Fatah, founder and managing director of MEX, a Middle Eastern consultancy service. Welcome to the show, Dr. Fatah.
Thank you.
But before launching into our discussion, let's take a look at this brief report.
Human trafficking is one of the largest and most profitable crimes in the world, affecting all sectors of society. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the Middle East and Africa region hosted the highest percentage of victims of human trafficking, with 68%. More than a quarter of all human trafficking victims detected are children, and the percentage is higher in some regions, according to UNODC statement, which noted that among each 4 victims there is 1 child. According to a report titled The Human Trafficking Cycle, Sinai and Beyond, an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 people were victims of trafficking between 2009 to 2013, and the Sinai trafficking industry generated $622 million in ransom. Unrest in the Middle East has played a pivotal role in accelerating human trafficking. Women fleeing conflict areas find themselves turning to prostitution, and a significant number of them are trafficked to other Middle Eastern countries as sex slaves or for sexual exploitation. The Heartland Alliance, a US organization that deals with human rights issues, has tracked 100 cases of human trafficking in Iraq during the past 2 years. Razan Daila, a representative of the organization in Iraq, said the majority of the cases the organization has tracked involve human organ trafficking, female sex trafficking and child slavery, and despite the fact that human trafficking in Iraq has clearly become a widespread phenomenon, the Iraqi government waited until 2012 to pass a law to combat the phenomenon. Despite a lack of hard data on the precise scale and nature of the problem, increasing numbers of government, social partners and civil society actors in the region have become engaged in tackling human trafficking. But with the rise of the Islamic State, is enough being done to tackle the issue?
Dr. Fatah, let's start off and focus on the media reports that girls and young women in Iraq are being captured by Islamic State group militants and separated from their families, forced into marriages and sexually abused under a growing system of slavery. Why are these girls being trafficked?
Okay, I think we have to separate 2 issues here. One is the human trafficking to Europe, and the other one internally displacement inside the country, inside Iraq itself. Of course, they are both together because the more trouble in the country, the more people leave and the more people displaced. So the number of people in both sides linked to the troubles in the country. Of course, since June, when the Islamic State attacked Mosul, and you know the rest of the history, all these people displayed in the country, and using a narrow interpretation of Islam, the Islamic State got all these women as slaves, especially the Yazidis, because they are non-Muslims. But of course, this is like it's a crime, and also it's for the, I guess, for their own pleasure. And the situation since then has been, I mean, probably we never know the real story, but it has been trouble for the women and young girls. And some of these are really very, very young. These girls, like maybe starting from 9 and so on. And they sold some of them, of course, in the open market, I say. But now the situation in Mosul is terrible because from my contacts, I know that the members of the Islamic State themselves exchange these Yazidi or other women between themselves. For example, one member of Islamic State has 3 Yazidi women, and sell it to another one between themselves. So the women do exchange hands, and they have no option to escape or to go anywhere because these are brutal people. You can't really do much about them. But the other side of the story, at the same time, many people live in the country because they've been displaced. They have nothing else to live for, coming to Europe, hoping for a better life. And then, most of them young families, like a young couple with a child or with 2 children, and so on. And they also become a victim of crimes on the way.
Yeah. Well, now let's take a look at this document allegedly circulated by the Islamic State, where they regulate the prices of humans, namely women. The document is stamped by the seal of the Islamic State. It starts with Bismillah Rahman Rahim and then briefly states that the volume of women's sales has dropped dramatically, which has repercussions on the Islamic State as it's one of its sources of income. The document features a chart where, for instance, Christian or Yazidi women aged between 30 to 40 should sell at 75,000 dinar. And the list goes on to children aged 12 months to 9 years. This category seems to have the highest, so say a price tag of 200,000 dinar. It's worth noting that all categories are solely of Christians and Yazidis. Dr. Fatah.
I'm not aware of that specific document, but because they find that if they are not Muslims, so they are halal, it means they can buy or sell, and they become their slaves, and especially Yazidis and Christians. Probably Yazidis worth because they are not Ahlul Kitab, they are not from one of the religious being recognized in Quran.
But on the point of the younger, I mean, why is it more important to possess a younger woman than, you know?
I guess that expresses the mentality of these sick people. Of course, I guess the younger the girl, excuse the language I use, probably the more pleasure they get out of them, and because you have to remember these are not ordinary people. They can behead individuals, they can behead their fellow human beings. So anyone who can behead somebody else obviously would enjoy punishing others. I guess a girl of 9 and so they will get more pleasure out of it because they can simply abuse them, and they get more pain out of them. And for them, pain is a pleasure. I mean, maybe it's a different way of thinking. You have to get into that frame of thinking.
Well, now over Skype is Koder Dimle, media trainer and freelance journalist based in Kurdistani region of Dohuk in Iraq. Koder, in October, United Nations researchers confirmed that 5,000 to 7,000 Yazidi women were being held by ISIS. Where are these girls now?
Yes, thank you. I from Europe, but say in 1,500. But to our follow-up case from the 3rd of August, now we have been make a statistic for more than 5,300 women and children who's been escaped, and the number of who've been kidnapped, and the number who've been escaped today, it's become more than 320 women and children and men. And most of those women who's been kidnapped by ISIS, they are in some villages and houses and some prisons, and also in the different city and town from Mosul to Tel Afar, Bahaj, and Hammam Alil, and Bilaj, Qayrawan, Raqqa, Manbij, Deir ez-Zur, and another village also who's around those areas. Started from Deir ez-Zur till Gayara in the south of Mosul.
And why are the Yazidis being specifically attacked?
Yazidis has been specific attack because the Islamic State in the mythology, when they come to Mosul, they say if any other religion who is not Ahlul Kitab, they don't have a right to live in the Islamic State. Because of that, when they give him 3 chances if they want to convert to Islam, or to pay jizya, or they should leave from Mosul. And they give him 3 days. And with other religions, with Kakai, they also don't give him a right to stay for Yazidis, because they think the Yazidis, they are not believer religion. So they just use him as spools of war. They use him as a slave till now. Every day when any new case is being escaped, they just describe out how they are in the bad conditions when they just, some families, they use more than small young girls as a slave at home with the families, with the children.
And what happens in the cases of girls refusing to follow ISIS's orders?
Sometimes they torture him. Sometimes they just sold him to another person, to another area. Should be like punishment. And also we have case being woman. When she refused, they torture him and violence him in a very bad way. One of the cases, it's been just released a couple of weeks. She refused to convert to Islam. They just torture her and they let her to wash his face by kerosene and another, I think, things we don't know what is that. So all of the faces be changed now. She getting now health care in Kurdistan region. She became better after 2 weeks of the some medicines. And another case we have been also when one of the women, she's been refused to convert to Islam. They try to torture her, punish her, to cut his fingers till she accept to become spools for one of the militarians.
Have you heard stories like this, Dr.
There
Fatah?
are many stories.
Yeah.
There are most of the time I try to avoid watching the videos, but I read them most of the time. Yeah, there are many stories, and of course suicide is becoming increasing in that region because if the woman find a chance to escape that pressure, they commit suicide. And
what about Yazidis converting? Do they? Have they?
I don't. I mean, if you maybe they do temporarily just to escape the pressure of Islamic State. I mean, to save your life, I guess one can do anything. But normally they don't convert. I mean, they have been living in that region with the Muslim Kurds for many years, or for, I don't know, hundreds of it at least, without much problem. But obviously, with the arrival of Islamic State, they don't have that luxury of living in peace, and that's really a big problem.
Kodeh, could you tell us more about what you've witnessed over the past few months?
The past few months, we've been follow up many cases, especially how ISIS, they deal with Yazidis women in the prisons. They use a big strategy when they deal with this case. It's really, it is a strategy has been planned very well. They change the place for some groups every 2 or 3 weeks. They change the place for some women from the house to others, from the families to others. They change the place for some young girls from Tel Afar to Ba'aj to Deir ez-Zur, those villages between Iraq and Syria and the borders. And our one is also sometimes to take some outcomes. We think ISIS, they just use those as spools of wars between himself, between the group to others, as a really one of the fact of the trafficking of human. Now Yazidis women, they being trafficking between ISIS themselves also, and also between some of the militarians from the villages to others, from the tribe to others, from the city to others. One of the cases this morning, she just been told me she's been sold by 3 persons. First, from Tel Afar, one of the militarians who live in Tel Afar. Then he gave him as a gift for one of his friends. He is a Saudian in Deir ez-Zur. Then the Saudian Arabian, when he just was with this young girl and with another 2, after 3 weeks, he sold her for another Iraqi man in Ba'aj. Ba'aj, it's one of the villages in the south of Sinjar, 50 kilometers. It's a base of ISIS and Al-Qaeda from 2005. Another thing that's very interesting for us also, that in some situations when they use some villages, they empty the villages from the regular people and they put all of Yazidis families and women, especially women who's been married there, in the really very bad condition. There are no enough food, there are no enough clothes. One of the women, she's been escaped last week. She just returned back with the clothes for the summer, for the August. She say from August till now, I don't have even enough clothes to take it there, and now the winter comes. And his son, he was 11 years, who is being tortured in the very bad situation. He is very sick now. Now he's in one of the private clinical from 1 week. I think maybe it take 2 more weeks to become better. Then all of these things, we try to just record it and also make it as every week as a report. How this situation, it has been really, it become up day by day. And another thing is very interesting for us, that last couple of weeks, especially from the beginning of this month, they change the place for many of women from our area around Al-Ahfar to Al-Raqqa. We don't know why they do that. And also, again, they return some of them just yesterday and then before yesterday. So this strategy is like just let the families and just follow-ups and the woman to be in another basis situation through ISIS.
Awful, awful. Well, thank you, Koda Dimle, for being with us. Dr. Fatah, do you think there is this threat of ISIS being exaggerated? Because there is talk about this in the media, how in the West we are exaggerating this sort of threat.
I think that probably there might be some exaggeration in their military presence,
Okay.
but there is a wider threat of ISIS. By ISIS, I don't mean the organization in itself, but the ideology of ISIS. Because I was in Iraq in September, just come back September, and when you talk to people, you could actually see the mentality of ISIS in some local people, and there are many fighters that join ISIS from different places in Iraq. They all join them. So the ideology is there, and I don't believe there is a military solution to ISIS. I believe it's a long battle of ideas which we have to get engaged.
Now, in the case of Syrian and Iraqi girls who arrive in, say, Lebanon with their husbands, and the husband tells the wife to go out with another man for sex just for once, for money, but doing so, she gets stuck in it because her husband says, well, if you don't continue, then I'll tell your parents in Iraq and Syria that you're a prostitute. I mean, how can we help these women and the social stigma being forced into prostitution in this way?
I mean, it's very difficult to combat prostitution, but obviously when the situation is there, when there's like people are in trouble and it's difficult to live, it will increase. I think Amnesty International called this type of prostitution sex slaves. And when you move on different cities of Iraq, even from Kurdistan down to Baghdad and the rest, you could see young girls begging on the streets, in the traffic lights. They clean the way you see here. They clean their windows, and obviously people can abuse them because they displace it. There is a link between displacement and crimes, because once you displace, especially in that culture, once you are no one, because when you are in your region, you've been there in your village, you are somebody, you have all these things that tie you to the community and you don't do much. But once that's totally destroyed and you go on the streets and you fight for your life, I guess you can't do anything. And this is really the problem. And it's like, how do you solve the problem of internally displaced people? Like if you take Syria, for example, a third of the population, 22 million people, are on the move, either outside the country or inside the country. In the case of Iraq, the areas controlled by ISIS as land goes, take Kurdistan out, is wider than the area controlled by the Iraqi government itself. So there's a major political crisis and social crisis also. How are you going to solve this? It's not really, there's not an easy answer to it.
Now, how come the laws are so vague? Because there's this, the fact that the Iraq's constitution adopted an article on making human and sex trafficking illegal. But
And I have when you talk about the Iraqi constitution, I think I laugh because nobody cares for the constitution, and the fact that you see the government creating all these militia groups, militant groups out of Shia. I mean, that's outside the constitution. The fact you see all these security services, all these private prisons, all these human rights abuses. It's just, I think the constitution is just something to show that they have something for the rest, for the world to see. But the Iraqi constitution, to put it very, very mildly, is suspended since the day it was created.
I mean, going back to the price list of the Yazidi women, I mean, do you think there was any significance with the price list excluding Shia Muslims?
I guess because I don't know, was there were no Shia?
No.
Because I guess they still regard Shia as Muslims because they believe in God and the rest of it, although they are in fight with them. But because it's very difficult to justify from the religious beliefs or religious teaching that the Shia are not Muslim. It's very, very hard. So the easiest option for them is like non-believers or maybe Christian who are believers, but they are not Ahl al-Kitab. They don't believe in Quran. They came before Quran. Maybe there's also another side of it. Maybe Shia is out of the area, but probably that's not true because I know that the Turkmen villages in Kirkuk were attacked. I am not sure whether they captured the women or not. But the Kakis who live like along the Turkmens on that border between Kurdistan and Iraq, they are also, because they are also not regarded as Muslims. They are much older than Islam.
And now I'd like to welcome over Skype in Turkey, Tracy Shelton, award-winning freelance correspondent and photojournalist covering Syria, Libya and conflict zones throughout the Middle East. Tracy, you've reported on the plight of the Yazidis in Dahuk, Iraq. Could you tell us more about what you witnessed over the past few months?
Yes, well, it's a horrific situation for them now. I mean, as you've been discussing, they've lost the women and children have been kidnapped. Many of the men were executed, and now they're living in terrible situations. They don't have proper shelter. They fled in the middle of summer, so they don't have winter clothes, winter provisions, blankets, and even food. It just really basic needs are difficult because of the overwhelming numbers of displaced people in the Kurdish area.
You've written that Yazidi girls tell tales of rape, forced marriage and enslavement. Is there a particular story that sticks in your mind?
Yeah, I met with some of these girls who have escaped. And yeah, I think probably the one that comes to mind the most was these two young girls. One was 14, one was 15. And probably I remember their story more than anything because of course it's a story of tragedy and just horrific treatment, but at the same time they were so brave and that they managed to escape. But yes, so they were given as slaves or wives, whatever you want to call them, to two Islamic State men. They described them as much older than they were, sort of elderly men, and they were treated very badly. They didn't describe it. It's very difficult for especially girls this age to be talking about sexual abuse, but it was definitely assumed they spoke about being given as wives. So but they talked about just the psychological torture, beatings. They used to make them watch videos of beheadings of Yazidi villages, and they would say, "Is this your father? Is this your uncle?" and things like this. You know, it was very, very difficult for them. So they they waited till these men had gone. They were living in the same house. So the men went to the mosque on a Friday, so they knew they'd be gone for an hour or more. So they broke out of the house. And this is in the middle of Fallujah. So this is one of the Islamic State's biggest strongholds that it has been for much, much longer than Mosul has. And a very Sunni Arab neighborhood, a lot of people loyal to the Islamic State there. So it wasn't any small thing for them to just escape into the street, but their only plan was to find a family with children. So they finally, after some time, I think that she said several hours that they were walking, they found some children playing outside. So they just broke into this living room of these people, or just burst in and said, "Can you help us?" And they did. They got them out. They risked their own lives to help these two young girls get back to their families.
A recent UN report has said that orphan children are under sexual assault and girls chained in markets for sale. Why isn't greater coverage given to these stories?
It's very hard to prove these things, especially when it comes to sexual abuse, because it's such a taboo subject. In the Arab world, in the Kurdish world, both culturally, religiously, and there is a lot of shame that comes with it as well. So even for these Yazidi girls that have escaped, it's very difficult for them very shameful for them to admit that they've been raped or abused. And the same with children and parents, especially with children, because you need permission for the parents as well to be speaking with them or to be confirming any of this, and nobody's going to give it. So it is very difficult to find anyone who will speak out because of the shame that comes with it. And as we're all probably aware, there's also a problem with the honour killings here. And that's all part of this. It's because of this belief that the shame is not only on the perpetrator, but it very much comes down onto the victim as well.
Did you meet any men who had bought female slaves?
No, I haven't actually. I've been trying to. I heard some rumours that there were men who had bought some of these Yazidi women and released them with the purpose of releasing them. But I wasn't able to confirm it. I spent several weeks trying to track down one of these women who had apparently been released in that way, because it's such a unique story, and it's something that's like a small ray of hope in the middle of all of this. But no, I haven't actually managed to meet any personally.
And in your opinion, whose responsibility is it to rescue the captured Yazidi women?
Well, I think the first responsibility is with the Islamic State, with members of the Islamic State, because although from the outside it looks as if they are unprincipled killers, kidnappers, rapists, however you want to view them, I do have a strong belief that many of these people have joined this state, have come here and joined this group for religious reasons, and surely there's people there that see that this is wrong. And not only that, there's also we already see many examples of people that are not by choice, but are just found themselves trapped in, people from Mosul, local citizens that have just found themselves living suddenly under the Islamic State after it took over, who have, when they had the opportunity, helped women escape. So I think, first of all, I would make a plea to anybody with a conscience that has any power to release any of them to do it. And then secondly, when it comes to the international community, it's very difficult because they are being held in areas that are well within the Islamic State. So trying to get them out by force is a very difficult task. But I guess if responsibility was to be placed, it would firstly go to the Kurdish forces who were protecting those cities before they were taken by the Islamic State. So I think, definitely they should be doing all they can, if it's possible, to get them out by force to do it.
Do you agree, Dr. Fatah?
I mean, there are areas, I agree that ISIS, of course, must have taken the responsibility. I know they are not a responsible organization, but they should take the responsibility. Kurdish forces have responsibility for areas under their control, of course. But I believe there are areas which is very sensitive. Of course, they cannot really move in because they are majority Arabs. For example, west part of Mosul, it will be very problematic for Kurdish forces to attack. And there's also just a problem on the ground. Like Mosul is the second biggest city of Iraq. And how are you going to fight ISIS where they are very well established, apart from street fighting? And I don't know how realistic that is really. And you can't bomb it because there are 2 million people living there. So what do you do? I think we are dealing in a very, very complex situation. I believe the international community must take the responsibility for somehow eliminating ISIS, because now don't forget, even in Libya, ISIS controlling places and towns and cities. So it is becoming more international issue than just local issue between Iraq and Syria.
Well, thank you very much for your participation, Tracy Shelton.
Thank you.
Dr. Fatah, what are the crimes of ISIS doing for the reputation of Islam?
Obviously, there are, whatever they do, let us agree, there are crimes against humanity, whatever they have done. I mean, that's under the international law and the international norm and conventions is against. But let us, looking at it religiously, I think people divided between them. Those who are if you like, atheists and anti-Islam, they believe this is the real face of Islam. And those who are Muslim and ordinary Muslim, like ordinary people you see of the streets, they believe that they are like an extreme case. They have nothing to do with Islam. So this is really opens up a debate, I think, for Muslim community and leaders to defend themselves. Are they accepting ISIS as a behavior or as an ideology of Islam, or they are detaching themselves from it? And in the end of the day, the Muslim leaders must realize this is damaging Islam more than anything else.
Yes, I was going to say, what should Muslims be doing to...
I believe Muslim leaders and communities must detach themselves from this narrow interpretation beliefs of which is, I guess, it must have some religious basis. They must detach themselves from that, otherwise they will do more damage, not only to the faith itself, but also to the race relations in the countries that Islam's, like Britain or like any other country. I think Muslim communities are in a very critical position now. They really must make it clear that they are more believing in cohesion and living together than issuing fatwa, killing anyone who is not believing in this narrow interpretation of Islam.
Yeah, scary stuff.
It is very scary.
I mean, have you heard stories in Britain of momentum building up to...
I don't no. I think Britain is. I haven't heard any stories, but obviously these things are not coming out just overnight. I believe probably it's boiling in both communities, whether you are Muslim or non-Muslim, and this is why probably the leaders, the political leaders, the social leaders, and the community themselves really they open up a debate. And I believe there is no any other, as a democratic society, we're not going to fight each other except for, with our ideas. And I believe opening up a debate is something good, because don't forget, 15,000 of these ISIS fighting in that region coming from the West. And it's very scary to see that somebody graduated in this country with university qualifications and with working experience can go there and behead people, or from France. I mean, one of those were discovered yesterday, recognized on the video, was a French national and was born. So this is really very scary. We must question ourselves what went wrong. Obviously something seriously went wrong. Like if I find, for example, my daughter's university graduate from this country, and tomorrow I find them fighting along the ISIS, where did that come from, as they say? So I believe we cannot just simply saying nothing happened now, we are all right. I mean, we have to have a debate about it in order to understand each other, probably in order for the parents to understand their children, because the parents would find heartbreaking to see the child is beheading somebody somewhere in the middle of nowhere.
And with regards to Iraqi and Syrian refugees who have seen being trafficked, are there families involved in their selling?
I don't think that's the norm. There must be one case or two cases, but which I am not aware. But I am not aware, which that's my job. I do that for a living. I am not aware of any parents selling their children for money. I don't think I'm aware of that. And on the contrary, there are very heartbreaking stories that the children separated from the parents.
And in your opinion, whose responsibility is it to save the Yazidi women?
I believe it's international community's responsibility. One person cannot take the responsibility. One organization cannot take responsibility. And we already know it's beyond the capabilities of those countries, Iraq and Syria. Well, Syria is not, nobody knows who is ruling in Syria. It's taken to pieces. But at least in Iraq, there is still a central government. I believe the international community must step in. Currently, it's just like bombing ISIS. I think it needs more than that in order to solve the problem.
And now, to shed more light from the Islamic perspective, we are joined by Professor Bernard Freeman, who teaches courses on modern-day slavery and human trafficking at Seton Hall University School of Law in New Jersey, and also specializes in Islamic legal history. Professor Freeman, in October, ISIS justified its use of women as sex slaves in its online magazine with claims that taking the women of infidels was permitted under Sharia law, and taking their women as concubines is a firmly established aspect of the Sharia or Islamic law. What do you say in response to this?
Well, I think it's really a misuse of Islamic law. There, for several reasons, you can disagree with ISIS's opinion. There are various ways of interpreting the Quran, such that at the time that the Quran was revealed, slavery was something that was a fact of life in society. But almost all of the Quranic verses on slavery deal with emancipation, and there are no verses that really would justify the taking of, especially non-combatants, anyone who is a non-combatant, taking them as a slave or taking a woman as a concubine as a result of war in the Quran. So where most of the ISIS justification comes from is actually from the imperial history of many of the early Islamic states, where as a matter of imperial policy, war policy, the leaders of these military operations would oftentimes take slaves and take women captives and convert them into concubines as a policy of war. But that's not really something that comes from the religious verses at all. And also, there's two other responses that one could give. There's chapter 90 of the Quran actually says that the good person, the person who is a good Muslim, is one who frees slaves, not one who captures and enslaves people. And so many scholars coming into the 20th century, after slavery was basically eliminated, chattel slavery was eliminated, scholars took the position that one of the intendments of the Quran, Rashid Rida, said there were 10 purposes of the Quran, and the 9th purpose was to bring about the elimination of slavery. And then a third basis, which shows that ISIS really is really off the track in terms of Islamic history, is the fact that there's now a consensus among all well-respected Islamic scholars that slavery can be no more. Under the Islamic law, the only way that one can become a slave is either born into slavery, which doesn't exist now, or if you are captured in a lawful jihad, and that would be a combatant who is captured in a lawful jihad, and then enslaved, and the verse there even requires ransoming when the war is over. So it's a very narrow, the law only permits a very narrow approach to slavery. It doesn't abolish it. ISIS is right about the fact that the Islamic law doesn't by the text abolish slavery, but the historical facts and the progress that we've made with respect to that, basically the Islamic law would agree that slavery can be no more.
Okay, and what do you think this is doing to the reputation of Islam?
What's your question again? It's hard to...
What is this doing to the reputation of Islam?
Say it again.
What is it doing to the reputation of Islam?
It's not good for the impression of Islam in terms of others. It's a non-Muslims. It is a very negative impression. Now, that in and of itself should not make a difference in terms of how you administer the law. There's oftentimes going to be law that is unpopular. You may have law that's unpopular and that the people may not necessarily agree with it. And Islam, I don't think it should take decisions. Islamic leaders should not take decisions on the basis of ingratiating themselves or making themselves, look in a good light by non-Muslims. But as a matter, if you're going to do war, if you're going to conduct military operations, one of the lessons of that is the attitude of the populace, the attitude of the people that you supposedly want to make life better for them. And if you're talking about enslaving people, everyone can see, any rational person should be able to see that that's not a situation that makes life better. So it's really not a good impression. It doesn't lead to a good impression at all. Although that's a side effect that I don't think someone who's thinking about slavery ought to not necessarily be a factor in decision making. One other thing, though, that is related to that is recognized by Islamic law is the idea of the public interest. The leader of the group should ask himself, what is in the public interest here when I'm making these policies? And slavery, everyone agrees, is not something that's in the public interest.
Well, Professor Freeman, thank you very much for being on the show.
Yep. Thank you, and you have a good day. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Anything to add to that?
Well, I totally agree with him. It doesn't do the reputation of Islam any good, and it's really for Muslims and Muslim countries, and also for Muslim leaders, community leaders, wherever they are, to detach themselves from these atrocities. And maybe it's also for us, the rest of the world, to conduct a debate the way we conduct it on this show, where we stand and where Islam stands. Whether if Muslim community wants for Islam to have a bright future among the international community and international people living on this planet, they really have to place themselves at a more peaceful and more part of the community than being isolated the way Islamic State has been isolated.
Well, as we can see, the plight of the Yazidis is just one part of human trafficking currently happening. Now let's take a look at other contributing factors to human trafficking in the Middle East. The media's recent attention on crimes by the Islamic State has made it seem that sex and labour trafficking rates are increasing. However, is a focus on the novelty of these events hindering deeper analysis of the complex and interconnected elements which are impacting trafficking in Iraq and Syria? What are the other factors affecting this trend? According to Kevin Bales, co-founder of Free the Slaves, political instability, transition, economic pressures, and other social or cultural features all contribute to the rise of human trafficking. Poverty, in particular, is a key factor influencing the demand for either sex or labour trafficking. When poverty is mixed with violence, the risk for both forms of trafficking is heightened. Dr. Fatah, I'd first like to address the question posed in my introduction. Is the media's recent attention on the ISIS-led crimes hindering a deeper analysis of the complex and interconnected elements which are impacting trafficking in Iraq and Syria?
I believe the focus so far has been on the military attack on the ISIS. That's one side of it, and that it's in a way it's sad to say, it has also a positive side, because, for example, in the Western world, Yazidis never known that there's, some scholars may have known that Yazidis are there, but ordinary people.
It's helped us find out.
It helped us to find out, help us to be more aware of the structure, because you always hear Iraq is a Muslim state, which doesn't really mean much, and now we know the complexity of the communities of Iraqi people, and I think that has been very helpful. But of course,
do we really understand them now?
Of course, we don't understand deeply, but this is probably, we start, probably now we are confused, but confusing is like the starting of understanding, I guess. But there are many other issues associated with the Islamic State and with that region itself that we have to understand, which really goes beyond the media reports. For example, you don't hear many stories in the media that how this affected displacement of people outside the region coming to Europe. We may see a small article in a paper about one individual, but we don't know the share of the displacement of people. And there are many other issues, like it's given to us as if this is done, just came out of blue, and we don't know really the history behind it. Obviously, it's not mushroom, just overnight. But the problem must have been the region before it starts. Maybe we need more attention, and now we are here. We really have to discuss, to debate what's the solution. How are we getting out of this mentality? How are we getting out of this extremism? We cannot have like a huge country between a huge land between Syria and Iraq be controlled by these fundamental people. We cannot.
But in terms of human trafficking, what about the social or cultural features contributing to them?
Well, it's obviously destroyed. For example, Yazidis were in that region for thousands of years, maybe not, maybe a few thousand at least. Now they've been displaced, and that culture is lost. Forget about it. We will never get Yazidis back in the way that they were lived before, and the way they have their, like, the place of worship, and the way they got together. They were a community. It's gone, because some of them is not going back to where they lived. And this really raises another issue, that it's, as an international community, it's our responsibility to protect these vulnerable people, their culture. But we failed them.
And more generally in the Middle East?
I think that's true for the Middle East. I mean, until recently, Kurds were for, the entire Kurds, people may think there are 40 million of them. We didn't know much about them until 1991, or maybe earlier, when they were gassed by Saddam Hussein. We didn't know. Despite that, they were even gassed. We didn't really care. We just read in the paper. So I believe the international community failed to protect vulnerable cultures, vulnerable people. And that's really the big question for us.
At this point, I'd like to introduce Carl Shembri, Middle East Regional Media Manager at Save the Children International. Carl, can you talk to us about the growing problem of child marriage among Syrian girls in Jordan?
Yes, this is one of the biggest concerns that we've witnessed over the last years. Child marriages in Jordan of Syrian refugee children have actually doubled. We now have doubled the figure of the girls who used to get married inside Syria under the age of 18. This is one unfortunate way of coping for the families who have fled the conflict. We're seeing that more children are getting married early on in their lifetime because for various reasons, but the most pressing reason being that the families cannot cope anymore. They need some kind of income, a fast way of making some income, and also shedding of the responsibility of yet another member of a family. This obviously has far-reaching consequences for anyone involved. The children end up missing out on their education. There is also a correlation between children who end up dropping out of school and getting married early on, as well as conversely, those who get married early tend to end up with no schooling because of their new status. And there's also all the problems of domestic violence that this tends to bring with it, and the obvious loss of childhood. Children under 18 have every right to keep living their childhood, playing, meeting similar children within the same age group, and dreaming of their future and aspiring to become whatever they dream to become. This is all wiped out, as we see, when children get married very early on.
And what is being done at Save the Children to protect children from being exploited and protected from trafficking?
We conduct a lot of awareness sessions with children whom we identify as being at risk of getting wed very early. We also obviously involve the families of such children, talking to them about their children's rights, their obligations as parents, and the risks that come with such an enterprise. Marrying children at a young age is clearly not the way forward, and we advise against it. There is an element of cultural predisposition to it. Already in Syria, before the conflict, 13% of marriages were child marriages. Now this has doubled in Jordan. We've seen that among the refugees. So what is a clear link is the desperation and the total lack of resources that these families have ended up with, being forced to get their children to marry in that way. So we do a lot of awareness sessions, but we also advocate both with governments and authorities, but also with donors. With more funding, we can stop this, and we can slow it down, at least, getting more children, keeping more children in education. One of our biggest concerns is that the Syrian children, both inside Syria and in the neighboring countries where there are refugees, are missing out on education, and we risk losing an entire generation of Syrian children. So it is absolutely imperative that more funding keeps coming, focused on education of Syrian children.
And what rights do children forced into labour actually have?
Well, they remain children, so they have all the rights of every other child in the world. The problem is that once they are in that status, most of those rights get wiped out in actual fact. They are no longer, it is very hard for children to keep going to school. It is hard for them to even pursue their ideas, their dreams of what they would have aspired to do in an adult life. They tend to be silenced and have no say in the running of the household. And so in actual fact, those children are stripped of their rights as children.
And what's being done to reintegrate these children into normal life?
Well, we speak to them and even their spouses and their families, and we make sure that we strike a balance between telling them their rights, but also making sure that they are not stigmatized and that they can return to some kind of childhood or anything that they aspire to, and making them aware that they have rights, that they can claim, and that they have a voice. So that's the basic level of our work with them. Sometimes we manage to dissuade families from getting their children married early, and that's a success for us. At other times when we don't, we have to make sure that these children are protected. We have counselors, we have experts who work with them, but it is admittedly a difficult, an uphill climb, because you are dealing with a very private, personal, family affair, and things are not always very easy on that level.
And lastly, why in the 21st century are boys and girls continuing to be killed, maimed and tortured?
Well, it is a tragic irony that we are asking this question precisely on the 25th anniversary since the declaration of the Convention for the Rights of the Child, which is a great, excellent document providing all the basic standard rights of children that every authority, every government should aspire to. And yet, we are still witnessing, like you rightly said, children being the victims of conflict, decisions made by adults, frankly, that are putting children on the front line, in the firing line. We as adults have not yet taken childhood seriously. We are basically forgetting that we were children, just like the children in front of us who are getting killed, tortured, abused, being deprived of their dreams, and it is an absolute failure of the adult majority of this planet and the decision makers. Someone somewhere has decided that for, in this case, Syrian children, their rights are not a priority, and the conflict goes on, and they are still the most vulnerable, the most innocent civilians in this conflict are still being targeted, are still being killed and victimized.
Thank you, Carl Shembri of Save the Children, for joining our discussion.
Thank you for having me.
And now with us over Skype is Andrew Harper, Chief of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Jordan. Andrew, you lead the UN humanitarian efforts to help the thousands of Syrian refugees who make the journey into Jordan. Could you give us an idea of the numbers of women and children refugees crossing the border into Jordan?
Okay, well, the total number of Syrians that we've got registered with UNHCR now is about 620,000. The total number of Syrians in the country are probably likely to be much more. The vast majority of those are women and children. Some 40% of Syrian families that we've got registered with us are headed by women, and so you start getting an idea of the vulnerability. In many cases, it's the most vulnerable who have fled to Jordan.
Well, that was my next question. Why are refugees specifically highly vulnerable to fall victim to trafficking?
Well, it's a situation where any person who is vulnerable, it doesn't matter whether they're refugees or anywhere else, are at risk of exploitation. Obviously, a situation that we have in any refugee environment means that people are outside their normal state protection, they're outside of their communities, they don't have the assets which they had before, the structures and safety nets that they previously relied upon have gone. And they don't know what the future holds for them in the future. In many aspects, you've got families who have lost the traditional head, whether they've been killed, whether they've been imprisoned, whether they've just gone missing. And so it just leads to certainly a massive increase in vulnerability and the potential for exploitation. It's one of the reasons why UNHCR exists, in order to represent the interests of refugees when there's no one else really to protect them.
What are the techniques used to lure women and children into being trafficked and into prostitution?
Well, I'm not in a position to sort of comment on various tactics or processes. The fact that it may happen is sufficient enough. So what we are trying to do is to prevent that from happening.
And how does?
But one of the challenges is.
I was going to say, how does your team protect them?
Well, we obviously try and work with the government authorities. In Jordan, the legal age of marriage, for instance, is 18. In Syria, it was much less. One of the challenges when we're talking about early marriage for Syrians is that many of the Syrians were actually married before they entered Jordan, and we have to try and find ways to regularize them. Also, in the context of groups who come from fairly conservative backgrounds in Syria or elsewhere, we're working with Islamic jurisprudence. We're working with the Sharia courts to make sure that Jordanian law, as a start, is observed, but also that they don't sanction a relationship, a marriage, which puts somebody in an extremely vulnerable position. We've got within the UN and our partners, we've established things like an interagency task force on early marriage. We'll work very closely with the relative departments within the government, like the Family Services Department, the Ministry of Interior. We work with our close colleagues in UNICEF, UNFPA, the Ministry, IOM. But the bottom line is we need to ensure that refugees have got the resources as well as the legal protection, so they're not forced to do something which they don't want to do. Just put yourself in a position that you're a refugee who has fled with 3 or 4 children who have come across from Syria. Your husband may have already been killed. You've sold everything. You've got nothing, and you're immediately in an extremely vulnerable situation. You don't have the resources to pay for food. You don't have the resources to pay for healthcare, to send your kids to school, pay for heating over the winter months which are coming up. So of course that makes it these populations extremely vulnerable. So we have to try and get as much assistance to these populations as we can, and we need to ensure that there's sufficient outreach to these vulnerable groups, hundreds of thousands of whom are basically anonymous because they're located in apartment buildings, or they're often out of the reach of normal assistance systems. So we've got a multifaceted strategy. Obviously, the Jordanian government does not want trafficking to occur. We work with our colleagues as well to make sure that the security authorities are trained, and that everyone who can influence the well-being of people who are extremely vulnerable are aware of the implications. One thing also is that if there are individuals leaving the camp, say they're underage, that we interview them and make sure that they're leaving the camp and they're not going to be put at further risk. So there's obviously limits to what we can do, but we recognise that we've got a responsibility to do more to try and protect those people who are extremely vulnerable.
Of course. And I've heard of parents in refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon sell their children. Are you dealing with such cases?
It's always like, it's difficult to sort of say, okay, like no one's going to admit that they've sold their child or have undertaken anything which has made their children put at risk. But what we try and do is make sure that any marriages that do take place are legitimate and that individuals are not forced into doing something against their will. Whether that occurs or not is something which sometimes is out of our control. But we do try and ensure that the people who, for instance, sanction the marriages, such as in the Sharia court or within the Jordanian legal system, are well aware of the particular risks of particularly young girls, and like they're aware of it as well. It's a extremely difficult situation, or it goes against the traditions of protection, the cultural traditions in Jordan, that someone who is being extremely vulnerable is further exploited. So there are cases that come up, and we try and intervene as much as possible, whether it be for early marriage or for what sometimes is alluded to as temporary marriages.
What do you think about the process that some organisations adopt to redeem slaves, buying them in order to set them free? Is this exacerbating the problem? I've
got no background, or I'm not in the position to comment on what those agencies do.
Sure.
Sorry.
And what reforms would you like to see being put in place?
Well, it's I think the operation so far is doing what we can to protect the girls, make sure that they've got opportunities to come forward. But it basically, it does go down to an issue of resources. Like we need to make sure that families have got the resources so that they feel confident enough that they can continue to look after all their children until such time that they can return back to Syria. We also do have to take into account that inside Syria, it was culturally acceptable to have marriages less than 18 years of age. And so what we had confronted, particularly early on in the operation, was that marriages would be stopped in Jordan because the children, because they were children, and the individuals would then return back to Syria, get married, and then return to Jordan married. So there was very little that we could do about it. But what I would be calling for is additional, largely financial support, the ability to provide cash assistance to families who have got children so they're not under any pressure, provide livelihood opportunities across the region so that Syrians can retain their dignity, increase their dignity, because it's very difficult for Syrians to work in many locations. And if you can't work and there's very little assistance, then we're contributing directly or indirectly to the vulnerability of these extremely at-risk populations, and they will be exploited. It is something which there's an equation to it. If you don't provide support, material support to refugees, then they will be at risk of exploitation, and the weakest of those people will be more vulnerable than anyone else. So it's not necessarily something that you need to overthink.
But isn't it also?
It's something that you.
Isn't also working with the Jordanians, helping them adapt to changes as well? You know, how they will work and welcome in the Syrians.
Yeah, the Jordanians have done an incredible job so far. It's obviously becoming more difficult as they have more and more refugees flooding into the country. But they've put in place laws and procedures which have attempted to protect all people, particularly the most vulnerable. And we are working with the Jordanians. Like in many aspects, the Jordanians are teaching us on how to deal with people who come from the region who are at risk. Just as we work with the Sharia court, it's not us always telling them what to do. It's also them sort of saying what is culturally and traditionally normal, what is acceptable, what is in the best interests of the child or of the individual. So it's a give and take sort of situation. We are learning every day as we're confronted by more and more challenges involving people at risk. And unfortunately, given the situation inside Syria, this population is only going to get larger, and the resources available to it are going to become smaller. And so we have to find ways in which we can ensure that the communities themselves take on a greater responsibility to protect the people within them.
Andrew Harper, thank you so much for this interview.
No, thank you very much.
Dr. Fatah, why is trafficking across the Middle East just so hard to eradicate?
It's very difficult because of the way the countries have been established. It's Iraq and Syria is just two countries next to each other for probably 4 years since the Ba'ath Party came to power in 1960s. No Iraqi can visit Syria. And this is the totalitarian mentality of the states made movement very, very difficult. So when the movement is very, very difficult, then trafficking becoming a business. I can smuggle you from Iraq to Syria and I charge you so much money. But of course, now it's a different stage of that. Now when all these countries are in trouble, trafficking is much easier because, don't forget the displacement and refugees is also business for some gangs. And these gangs make a huge sums of money. And also it's associated with crime, it's associated with drugs, it's associated with sex, and so on. The problem is really very, very big. We haven't scratched the surface yet.
And what can be done on a governmental level across all parties involved, do you think, to end trafficking?
You mean governments in the Middle East or just the...
Middle East or Western?
Yeah, mean, in the Middle East, the government has really lost control at the troubled area. Like the areas we are discussing, Iraq and Syria, they lost control, so there's not really much of the government list, so they cannot really control those areas. But how does maybe the international community, like Europe and the rest of the world, can help? I believe there is no overnight solution for that. We just have to look at I think the main problem starts from the regimes of the Middle East. Unless you have more open and democratic and civil society, you will have trafficking all the time, because the standard of living will be low and the oppression will be very high. So everybody wants to leave the country for a better life, and the better life is Europe. The other side of this is when the country is oppressed and is closed, then you will have trouble, like the way we have it in Iraq and Syria, and of course in North Africa too. So it's not really a solution overnight, but maybe as an international committee we can force these countries to be more open. Maybe we highlight their human rights abuses and so on. Maybe the only way we can stop that is the Middle Eastern countries, the countries that troubles are, to be more open, more democratic, allow the civil society. And I don't think that will happen like in the very short period of time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fatah.
You're welcome.
While ISIS has undoubtedly contributed significantly to the flows of human trafficking in the Middle East, there are multiple other factors impacting trafficking. If we fail to acknowledge the diverse historical, social, economic, political, cultural, and ecological contributors to human trafficking in both Syria and Iraq, we risk missing context-specific solutions. Only through a deeper, holistic analysis of human trafficking in the Middle East can activists begin to formulate an appropriate solution and strategy aimed at addressing its root causes. I'd like to thank all my guests today, Professor Bernard Freeman, Koda Dimle, Tracy Shelton, Andrew Harper, Carl Shembri, and of course my guest in the studio, Dr. Rebwa Fatah. Until next time.